cameras were rolling, the lighting was clinical, and the tension in the London studio was thick enough to cut with a blade. When elite British journalist Sarah Jenkins sat down to interview the enigmatic Russian TV host Katerina Volkov, she expected a routine exercise in intellectual superiority, a chance to dismantle what she perceived as state-sponsored charisma with cold, Western logic. Sarah began the broadcast with a sharp, condescending smirk, tossing out barbs that painted Katerina as a mere puppet of the Kremlin. But as the minutes ticked by, something unexpected began to happen across the digital landscape. What started as a televised mockery soon transformed into a global phenomenon as viewers ignored the scripted jabs and fell in love with Katerina's composure, wit, and defiance. Before we dive into the incredible story of how a planned public shaming backfired and turned an underdog into an international icon, I want to know who is joining us today. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments right now. The atmosphere inside the sleek, glass-walled studio of Global News UK was electric, humming with the quiet, kinetic energy of a high-stakes media event that had been months in the making. Sarah Jenkins, a veteran correspondent known for her Iron Lady approach to interviewing foreign dignitaries, adjusted her earpiece while glancing over her notes with a look of palpable disdain. Across from her sat Katerina Volkov, the rising star of Moscow's evening news, a woman whose popularity in Eastern Europe had become a thorn in the side of Western media narratives. Sarah's goal for the evening was not a balanced dialogue. It was a surgical deconstruction of Katerina's credibility, designed to show the world that the Russian host was nothing more than a polished face for a rigid regime. As the floor manager counted down from 10, Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to launch a rhetorical assault that she believed would end Katerina's international aspirations before the first commercial break. As the red on-air light flickered to life, Sarah didn't waste a second on pleasantries, immediately launching into a monologue that framed Katerina as a propagandist rather than a peer. She mocked Katerina's accent, her wardrobe, and even the dramatic flair of Russian news broadcasts, framing them as a desperate attempt to mask a lack of substance. The British audience, initially conditioned to cheer for their homegrown hero, watched as Sarah lobbed one verbal grenade after another, expecting Katerina to stumble or react with predictable anger. However, Katerina remained unervingly still, her hands folded neatly on the desk, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips that suggested she was playing a completely different game than the one Sarah had prepared for. The contrast was immediate and jarring. Sarah was loud, aggressive, and increasingly frantic, while Katerina projected an aura of serene confidence that made the studio's aggressive lighting seem to soften around her. By the 20-minute mark, the planned mockery began to take on a desperate quality as Sarah realized her insults weren't landing with the impact she had envisioned. She attempted to fact-check Katerina in real time, using prepared slides that were meant to humiliate the Russian host. But Katerina's responses were swift, eloquent, and delivered with a razor-sharp wit that caught the production crew off guard. When Sarah mockingly asked if Katerina's scripts were personally vetted by the Kremlin's inner circle, Katerina leaned in and replied that she found it fascinating how a journalist from a free press seemed so obsessed with scripts rather than the reality of the people living the stories. This moment, captured in a tight close-up, began to ripple through the internet almost instantly, as viewers on Twitter and TikTok started sharing clips of the unflappable Russian, who was making the veteran British interrogator look like an amateur bully. The tide of public opinion started to shift visibly in the live comment sections of the broadcast streaming platforms, where thousands of people were tuning in from across the globe. People who had no previous interest in Russian politics or British media found themselves captivated by the sheer charisma Katerina displayed under fire, viewing her as a symbol of grace under pressure. They saw a powerful woman being bullied on international television, and instinctively the underdog effect took hold, turning Katerina into a sympathetic figure. Memes began to circulate within minutes, contrasting Sarah's contorted, angry expressions with Katerina's calm, statuesque poise, often accompanied by captions about the difference between shouting for attention and commanding a room. The very tool Sarah intended to use to destroy Katerina's reputation, the high-definition cameras and the global reach of the network, were now being used to broadcast her own loss of control to millions of new fans. As the interview reached its midway point, the producers in the control room began to panic, watching the analytics show a massive surge in viewership that was primarily coming from outside the UK. They realized that the mockery was generating a viral wave of support for the guest, yet they couldn't cut the feed because the numbers were the highest the network had seen in a decade. Sarah, sensing the shift in the room but unable to see the digital metrics, doubled down on her hostility, pivoting to personal questions about Katerina's life in Moscow in an attempt to rattle her. She suggested that Katerina was only successful because of her looks and her proximity to power, a classic trope intended to diminish a woman's professional achievements. Katerina's response was a masterclass in diplomacy. She simply thanked Sarah for noticing her hard work and remarked that in her country, they were taught that true beauty lies in the ability to withstand a storm without losing one's soul. This specific quote, "withstanding the storm without losing your soul," became the rally cry for a new legion of Katerina supporters who dubbed themselves the Volkov Vanguard. On platforms like Reddit and Instagram, fan pages were being created in real time, archiving every clever retort Katerina made and analyzing the power moves she was using to dismantle Sarah's ego. The British journalist, once the darling of the London media circuit, was now being described by international viewers as bitter, condescending, and out of touch. The irony was delicious to the digital audience. A woman who set out to prove her guest was a fake had inadvertently exposed her own lack of professional decorum. As the interview continued, the power dynamic in the room had completely flipped, with Katerina now subtly leading the conversation and Sarah trailing behind, trying to regain a footing she had lost the moment she prioritized mockery over journalism. By the final segment of the show, the atmosphere in the studio had turned cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the realization that a media execution had turned into a coronation. Sarah's voice had grown hoarse, her questions becoming repetitive and defensive as Katerina continued to offer insightful, nuanced perspectives on global affairs that challenged the audience's preconceived notions. The climax of the evening came when Sarah asked a final, sneering question about whether Katerina thought she could ever be a real journalist in the West. Katerina paused, looked directly into the camera lens as if she were speaking to every viewer personally, and said that she had no desire to be a real journalist if it meant losing the ability to respect one's guest. The silence that followed was deafening, and as the credits began to roll, the production staff sat in stunned silence while the internet exploded in a frenzy of applause for the Russian star. In the aftermath of the broadcast, the Katerina effect became a case study in modern viral dynamics, as her follower counts on social media skyrocketed by several million in less than 24 hours. Media outlets from New York to Tokyo were suddenly clamoring for interviews with the woman who had destroyed Sarah Jenkins with nothing but a smile and a few well-placed words. Sarah, meanwhile, faced a wave of domestic backlash, with even her own colleagues questioning her aggressive tactics and suggesting that she had disgraced the network's reputation. The narrative had been completely rewritten. Katerina was no longer a Russian puppet. She was a global icon of feminine strength and intellectual resilience. The British journalist had intended to make Katerina a laughingstock, but instead she had provided the perfect stage for Katerina to prove she was one of the most formidable media personalities in the world. The story took an even more fascinating turn when Katerina returned to Moscow, greeted not just as a national hero, but as an international celebrity whose appeal crossed political borders. She began hosting a new show that focused on cross-cultural dialogue, a direct jab at the confrontational style of her British counterpart, and it became an instant hit across Europe and North America via subtitles. Viewers who had first discovered her during the infamous London interview stayed for her intellect and her unique ability to humanize stories that were often buried under political rhetoric. She had successfully bypassed the traditional media gatekeepers, using their own platform to build a direct connection with a global audience that valued authenticity over scripted hostility. The mockery had served as a catalyst, stripping away the labels that had been placed on her and revealing a woman of substance who could hold her own against any adversary. Months later, the London interview is still cited by media analysts as the moment the old guard of journalism lost its grip on the narrative to the power of viral personality. Sarah Jenkins eventually issued a public apology for her tone, but the damage to her brand was permanent. She had become the poster child for the mean girl style of reporting that the digital age was rapidly rejecting. In contrast, Katerina Volkov's name became synonymous with the graceful counter, a term used to describe someone who wins a conflict by refusing to descend to the level of their attacker. This frictional story of two women, a studio in London, and a global audience proves that in the modern world, the person who tries to humiliate another often ends up being the one who is humbled. Katerina didn't just survive the mockery, she owned it, turned it into fuel, and used it to launch a career that reached heights even she had never imagined possible. Reflecting on the specific mechanics of the viral explosion, it becomes clear that the British journalist mocked a Russian TV host. Incident resonated because it tapped into a universal frustration with perceived elitism. People watching from their living rooms in Brazil, India, and the United States saw Sarah Jenkins as the embodiment of an arrogant establishment that talks down to everyone else. When Katerina Volkov stood her ground, she wasn't just defending herself. She was defending every person who has ever been belittled by someone who thought they were better because of their background or accent. This emotional connection created a protective shield around Katerina, making her immune to Sarah's insults and transforming her into a vessel for the audience's own desires for justice and parody. The viral nature of the event was driven by this raw human identification, proving that a story about media bias is always at its heart a story about human dignity. The technological aspect of this story cannot be overlooked, as the rapid-fire editing of best of clips and thug life-style compilations played a massive role in cementing Katerina's star status. Young creators on TikTok took the hour-long interview and condensed it into 60-second masterclasses in psychological dominance, reaching a demographic that never would have watched the original broadcast. These creators used music, subtitles, and zoom effects to highlight Katerina's micro-expressions, the slight raise of an eyebrow, the calm blink of an eye, contrasting them with Sarah's increasingly erratic body language. This decentralized PR campaign was more effective than any professional marketing firm could have ever been, as it felt organic and grassroots. It showed that in 2026, a reputation is no longer made in the boardroom or the editing suite, but in the hands of millions of individuals with smartphones and an opinion. As Katerina's influence grew, she began to use her platform to advocate for a more empathetic form of global communication, often referencing her experience in London as a turning point in her own life. She admitted in a later podcast that she had walked into that studio feeling terrified and defensive, expecting to be eaten alive by a legend of the industry. However, she realized within the first 5 minutes that Sarah was not debating her ideas, but attacking her identity, and that realization gave Katerina a strange sense of peace. She understood that if her opponent had to resort to insults, it meant her opponent had already run out of valid arguments. This philosophy, that the first person to get angry is the first person to lose, became a cornerstone of Katerina's public persona, inspiring millions of her followers to adopt a similar calm in the storm approach in their own personal and professional lives. The legacy of this event continues to ripple through the media industry, with the Volkov interview now being taught in journalism schools as a cautionary tale of what not to do. It serves as a reminder that the camera is a truth teller that captures more than just words. It captures intent, character, and the subtle energy between two people. Sarah Jenkins' career became a footnote, a lesson in how quickly the mocker can become the mocked in an era of total transparency. Meanwhile, Katerina Volkov continues to shine, a living testament to the fact that when someone tries to dim your light, they often end up giving you a bigger stage to shine upon. The story remains a viral favorite because it satisfies the human craving for a David versus Goliath outcome, where the underdog uses the giant's own strength to bring them down, all while maintaining an impeccable sense of style and grace. Ultimately, the transformation of Katerina Volkov from a regional TV host to a global star is a story about the power of the audience to decide who they want to listen to. In the past, a journalist like Sarah Jenkins could have framed the narrative and moved on, leaving her subject's reputation in tatters with no way for the subject to respond. But in our interconnected world, the audience has the final say, and they chose the woman who showed strength without cruelty and intelligence without arrogance. Katerina's journey from a target of mockery to a beacon of international stardom is a reminder that your greatest challenges can become your greatest opportunities if you have the courage to remain true to yourself. It was a night that changed two lives forever, one falling from grace, and the other rising to meet a destiny she never expected, all because of a single televised encounter that the world refused to forget.